of research at Newcastle University. That's also where the first AFINet conference took place. She leads a large program on research focused upon intervention, development, and evaluation to improve outcomes for disadvantaged children and families. And a central strand of this work is concerned with parental substance use and other family risk factors, including domestic violence, which mental health and families who are at the edge of care. And Ruth has published widely on these topics and acted as a co-opted member of the Drug Strategy Prevention Working Group Advisory Committee for Misuse of Drugs. And she's a qualified social worker and counselor who is specialized in drug and alcohol treatment, and her work aims to have a real-world impact upon policy and practice. So her research partners with practice and policy colleagues, as well as children and family with lived experience, and often taking a co-production approach. She has awarded 2 prestigious National Institute for Health and Care Research personal fellowships. And the webinar she will be presenting is on the program of work she completed during her recently concluded fellowship, Promoting Alcohol Reduction in Non-Treatment Seeking Parents, the Parent Study. And as you can see, she will talk about developing brief alcohol interventions for risky drinking parents who are in contact with children's social care. And we're very happy to have you. And I'll just hand over to you, Ruth, and you have about 45-50 minutes. And afterwards, there will be enough time for questions, remarks, and the like. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Gallus, and also for the invitation to speak at the webinar today. You might hear my voice is a little bit croaky. I woke up this morning without one, but I've rested it all day. The people close to me might tell you that's because I use it too much. So I've rested it all day, and hopefully it'll hold out for that period of time that we have. So yes, I'm going to talk to you specifically. The Parents Study is about development and evaluation of brief alcohol interventions for risky drinking parents. But I'm going to be concentrating today on the process by which we undertook the development of the brief alcohol interventions. And hopefully the slides you can see okay just there. So the background to the Parents Study is that there's a large number of children in the UK that live with at least one parent who misuses alcohol. Depending upon what statistics you look to, that's between 5 and 30%. And I guess the reason for the differentiation between those percentages is about how you consider, how you define risk. And that's something I'll come back to in a little bit. But those high rates are found in many countries, if not most countries around the world. And we know that alcohol misuse increases the risk of harm to the individual drinker. But when that person who does misuse alcohol is also a parent of a particularly dependent age child, there may be an increased risk of harm for the child also. And that impact that we see on children whose parents use alcohol as well as other substances results in those children coming into contact with services, child welfare services. In the UK, we refer to that as children's social care. And around about 20% of all assessments of children which are deemed to be children in need identify parental alcohol misuse as a risk factor for the child. Now, many of those parents are what we might refer to as hazardous or harmful alcohol users. So they're parents who are regularly drinking above the recommended amounts in a way that places them at risk of harm, or where they're already experiencing some of those harms, but are most likely falling below the threshold for alcohol treatment. And this results in many of the parents whose children are in contact with social care, where there's concerns around the parents' alcohol use linked to the child's welfare, receiving no intervention at all. And that might be because the alcohol treatment services don't feel they can offer them anything, or because the parent themselves doesn't recognise alcohol treatment as being appropriate for them. Now, there's a large and robust evidence base for brief alcohol interventions to reduce hazardous and harmful drinking. In fact, it's the largest evidence that we have for alcohol interventions. And there's largely two types of brief alcohol interventions, although there's no agreed definition specifically of what a brief intervention is. But the two types are, broadly speaking, simple structured advice, which can range from 5 minutes of advice, slightly above that. And within that advice, people are tended to be provided with information about consumption levels, recommended levels, and also what the risks associated with that particular pattern of drinking are. The other type of brief alcohol intervention we often see is a brief lifestyle intervention. This varies again in what tends to be involved in the length of that particular intervention, but often, certainly within health, we see those interventions for around about 20 minutes, and they tend to be based on motivational interviewing and have a semi-structured approach. And it's about helping that particular individual to consider the drinking and how it might impact upon them and what their motivations for making any sort of change in relation to that might be. So the majority of the evidence that we have for these brief alcohol interventions comes from primary health care. And your kind of traditional, your stereotypical interaction would be that a patient would attend the GP practices or primary healthcare centre, and during a consultation with the clinician, that clinician would help the patient to link their drinking patterns with presenting health risk. And as a result of the large evidence base that exists for those types of interventions, in the UK, NICE has recommended brief alcohol interventions for a range of health settings and also other more novel settings, including social care. But really, there's a lack of studies examining brief alcohol interventions in social care, but also within a parenting population. So we know very little about the acceptability of these interventions to the social care workforce, to the parents themselves, or what the optimum implementation approach for these interventions might be. We really don't also know whether that brief intervention structure that I mentioned, that is often implemented in health, would transfer to a children's social care workforce, where we know there are likely to be different working practices and priorities. Brief interventions in this setting may promote a parent's ability to link their drinking behaviour with adverse experiences or risks for the child or the family, much like that example I gave of the GP practice, and therefore may replicate that teachable moment that has been found to be conducive of behaviour change in health. However, the brief intervention content and structure is very likely to need to be adapted for this particular setting and also for this particular population. Children and families in contact with children's social care often experience really very complex problems, and the children's social care workforce has a responsibility to protect those children, and at times even remove the children from situations of significant harm. So these are really important contextual factors that are likely to impact upon brief alcohol intervention in this setting with this population. So I took a mixed method approach in order to try and understand how best to adapt brief alcohol interventions for parents in contact with children's social care services. We started off initially by conducting a systematic literature review, which I'll talk about in a moment. We also conducted a qualitative study. There's been some trialling of the intervention within a pilot feasibility RCT, but also within a local authority area in London. And we also completed a discrete choice experiment. Each of these I'll go into in a little bit more depth. So starting with the systematic literature review, we registered it as a Cochrane review, and that review was to examine the effectiveness of psychosocial interventions to reduce parental drug and alcohol use. And we anticipated that there would be a lack of studies examining early intervention with parents. However, we thought that there could be some important lessons that we could learn from approaches to reduce substance use in parents, including those that would be defined as dependent levels or more traditionally responded to with treatment. As a result, we did include all risk levels of alcohol and drug use, including those levels below the diagnostic threshold, which I guess within the intervention itself, the brief alcohol intervention, will be our target population, as well as those that were heavy end and dependent use. Similarly, we included any psychosocial intervention from single session, which might be more traditionally aligned to brief alcohol interventions, through to quite long-term intensive treatment. The comparisons that we would consider within our inclusion criteria were a wide range of different comparison interventions, from no intervention, controlled trials, through to active comparison of other potentially evidence-based interventions. Our primary outcome was of interest was a reduction in the frequency of alcohol and/or drug use, and we included studies using a trial design. After developing a search strategy based on this inclusion criteria in order to identify the international literature, we implemented that in multiple electronic databases. And after applying that inclusion criteria, we were able to identify 28 papers which reported on 22 unique studies meeting our inclusion criteria. 8 of these studies were pooled within a meta-analysis, and it's the meta-analysis that I'm going to present on today. So we put all of these interventions together, and we looked at the interventions by parents who used alcohol and parents who used drugs. And we found that these interventions were effective, particularly around reducing drug use in parents. But there was a lot of different interventions in that mix, and we felt that actually really, in order to understand that literature and to really understand the effect of the interventions, we need to examine the effect of the intervention depending upon the type of psychosocial intervention. And we analysed separately those interventions which sought to target the substance use behaviour only, those interventions which targeted parent behaviour only, so parent skills training would be the most usual, and those that targeted parent and drug and alcohol interventions together. And what we found was that parent interventions which integrated a substance use component, treatment component, were associated with a reduction in the frequency of parental alcohol use at 6 and 12 months and parental drug use at 6 and 12 months. But conversely, those interventions that only looked at substance use treatment or only looked at parenting skills were not effective for either substance at any time point. We then looked at child involvement. So we looked specifically at those interventions which included family as a focus. So the ones that were parent skills training or similar, where there was an emphasis on family relationships. And we found that interventions which involved children in 1 or more sessions did not reduce the frequency of parental alcohol use or drug use at 6 or 12 months. And it was only those interventions that didn't involve the child directly where we found effect. And again, we did find that effect in both alcohol and drug use at 6 and 12 months. So those parents where they were not receiving the intervention, the children made significant reductions across the different time points. We further investigated the intervention effect by the parental role. So looking at this specifically in relation to mothers and fathers. And we found that fathers' substance use in particular seemed to benefit from the psychosocial interventions. So results showed that at 6 months follow-up, both interventions which targeted mothers and interventions which targeted fathers resulted in a reduced frequency of alcohol use. This effect was lost for mothers at 12 months, but we saw it again for fathers at 12 months. So fathers managed to reduce and maintain their reductions at 12 months relating to alcohol. And then repeating that analysis for drug use, we found that fathers significantly reduced their drug use at both 6 and 12 months, but neither time point showed reductions for mothers. So what did we take from all that? Well, we thought that addressing parenting explicitly alongside alcohol and drug use may offer a mechanism for change. And I guess that was important because in the UK, often these are responded to separately. So you would see parenting would be addressed potentially from family services or children's social care, and children's social care would traditionally refer parents into alcohol treatment or drug treatment, as the case may be, and they would be dealt with very separately. Methods of interest to this network in particular is the involvement of the child within those interventions. And we know from the affected family member literature that often family members are involved in drug and alcohol treatment because it's perceived to bring about some benefit to the user and to have involvement. So the families could be somehow part of the solution in reducing substance use. However, what we found in our, as I've shown in our meta-analysis, is involvement of the child actually made it less likely for the parent to be able to achieve some change in relation to their substance use. And we're unable to confidently say why that is. However, we did theorize that maybe the presence of the child in the sessions may have inhibited the parent's ability to engage in the intervention in some way, either due to a desire to shield the child from the realities of their use, and therefore somehow minimized or was unable to really talk about the things that they needed to talk about. Or maybe it's possibly to deflect judgment placed upon the parent or perception of that judgment. Well, based on low quality evidence, father substance use did seem to benefit more from the intervention, and whilst only short-term reductions were found for mothers in alcohol. And we think that was really possibly because of the complexity of some of the needs of the women that took part in those studies. We saw that most of the women received parent skills interventions without drug treatment, and that might be because of the emphasis that is placed on our society upon female caregivers, and that maybe there was an emphasis more on their parent role as opposed to their own needs as a person who may use substances. But also really the mothers within the studies often, as I mentioned, had really complex needs. The fathers contributed, the studies looking at the fathers contributed 4 intervention groups from 2 studies. And we found that the interventions that the fathers received were quite intensive. So there was a mean of 28 sessions compared to 18 sessions for the women. So they tended to get a bit more intervention. But also the fathers seem to possess what we might refer to as components of recovery capital. So they were more often employed. The studies that we examined were couples therapy. So as a result, they were required to have a supported partner. And part of the eligibility criteria for that was the fact that those partners themselves were not a substance user. They often were employed. Again, another requirement of those trials was that the fathers would have at least 1 child in their care. Conversely, the mothers often possessed little recovery capital, so they were typically single or in a relationship with a male drug user. They often had low levels of education, employment, or income. And moreover, the mothers in our review often accrued what you might refer to as negative recovery capital. So they had often had previous periods of incarceration, were currently homeless, had mental health problems, had experienced trauma such as child abuse, and many of them had children removed from their care. So really, it may be that there's some thought needed to be given to how to respond to some of those kind of complex needs and the cumulative of the risk that many of the women that may require an intervention experience. The other thing that we found, I guess, which we started off assuming we would, was a lack of studies examining secondary preventative interventions. So as a result, we really need to take that learning, but try and understand it within the context of the population that we're trying to intervene with, which is parents who are drinking alcohol, so not parents who are necessarily being intervened with around their drug use, but also at the level which certainly would be below the threshold for many of the interventions that were received within that literature that we included in the meta-analysis. So to build on the learning from the systematic literature review and consider how these principles could be applied in an early brief intervention, we conducted qualitative interviews with parents. We recruited 14 mothers and 8 fathers who were in contact with early help services, and children's social care in the northeast of England. We conducted 3 focus groups with social care practitioners, and also 1 focus group with practitioners from specialist alcohol treatment. And the analysis of that data resulted in 4 main themes. The first was the threatening context of safeguarding. I think this maybe could be applied to parenting more generally, but in particular, parents who are in contact with family support services where there is already a question about the welfare of the child or the functioning of the family really experienced a lot of this threat. And many of the parents and practitioners reflected upon it. Practitioners in particular highlighted how they found discussing alcohol use with parents to be quite difficult. They found it difficult to open the conversation, to ask the question. They also questioned the likelihood that parents would feel able to disclose the information openly and honestly about their alcohol use. And there was a sense that maybe at times it might not be appropriate to ask parents about alcohol, and particular points in their the social care practitioners' involvement with the family. Conversely, however, parents reported that they did think it was legitimate for social care practitioners to ask them about their alcohol use. However, many reported that it had not been raised with them from the social care practitioner, and many of them also said that they wished that they had initiated the conversation, that this might have helped them to begin the conversation with the practitioner that would be helpful to them. Central to all of this, however, was the importance of a strengths-based approach, wherein parents really needed to feel that they weren't being judged for their alcohol use before they would be able to talk about it with the social care practitioners. The next theme was the importance of the relationship. So this was probably a major theme, I'd say, in all of the interviews, and also consistently throughout the focus groups. When a relationship was considered strong, this was highlighted as a mechanism for change, wherein the relationship could become the work. And the thing that helped the parent really was that respect, that relationship they had with that worker. Further, if the practitioner did manage a supportive and non-judgmental conversation around alcohol, many of the parents and practitioners highlighted how this could actually further strengthen the relationship and result in much wider benefits from the family and the care that ultimately is provided. Where support was not offered directly by the practitioner, however, this was often experienced negatively by the parents, who could sometimes feel a bit let down by the practitioner, who they perceived maybe just didn't care. And actually this conversely had the impact of further damaging the relationship. Thus, therefore really suggesting that practitioners within children's social care may be well placed in the right conditions, may be well placed to deliver brief alcohol interventions to the parent, and really the right conditions is about attending to that threatening context of safeguarding and navigating that. Practitioners and parents described family situations of acute and chronic stress, and often alcohol was only one of the issues that were of concern and being addressed within that particular interaction. And some of the times, and often actually, these other issues were more immediate, were a greater priority, or just more obvious to the practitioner. And as such, it may take some time before the practitioner was able to discuss topics such as alcohol with parents. In some circumstances, the parent may underreport their alcohol use, particularly when they were first asked, and if that was early on in the relationship, only to later disclose risky levels of alcohol use. And as such, alcohol was considered to be an important ongoing conversation rather than an event, a part of a question that's on an assessment or a screening tool that's done and put aside. So talking about the family, it was the fourth and final theme. Practitioners and parents all highlighted the importance of discussing alcohol in relation to the family, and that was clearly a theme that came out of the systematic literature review. In particular, children were highlighted as a motivational factor for parents to reduce their alcohol use. However, given the threat of safeguarding within this context, it was stressed that this needed to be carefully balanced, so as not to induce shame or a sense of feeling judged within that conversation. So that was really quite a difficult boundary to navigate, I think. So from that, we developed adapted the existing brief alcohol intervention structures, and we produced 2 levels of intervention that were meant to be similar, I guess, but relevant and salient to this population, similar to the brief alcohol interventions I mentioned at the beginning, which are often used in health. This one is, I guess, similar to the simple structured advice that often takes around about 5 minutes, includes information about risks. And this is meant as an A3 sheet of paper, printed on both sides, where the idea would be that the practitioner would sit, they'd ask some questions around alcohol, they'd identify alcohol as being relevant, and then they would proceed to give a little bit of information about some potential risks that might relate to the parent themselves, but also the child and the household and the daily routine, before then asking the parent to reflect on that information and think about the things that are relevant to them, and ultimately to think if they might want to make a change. So we developed this based on the systematic literature review and the qualitative interviews. We included protective factors as a way of trying to recognise some of the strengths that existed within the family, but also as a means of a platform to build upon within the parenting plan. The idea with this particular intervention within the feasibility trial will be that this will be delivered by the social care practitioners themselves within their routine care. The next intervention is a structure that was intended to be delivered by a specialist alcohol provider. Here, the parent would receive the simple structured advice from the social care practitioner first, and then be offered a referral on to specialist alcohol services. And this was more in line with the brief lifestyle intervention that I mentioned at the beginning, but again with a focus upon the family and what the benefits could be for the family as well as for the parent. So these interventions were piloted within a 3-arm pilot feasibility randomized controlled trial, which I haven't got time to talk about in depth today, but it was compared against a minimal intervention, which was a public health intervention. It was compared, level arm 2 was just the brief advice that was given by the social care practitioner, whereas the 3rd arm was the advice plus this referral on with an optional attendance from the parent. This intervention that was delivered within the alcohol provider service was round about 40 minutes, semi-structured conversation, but there was also an option for the parent to come back and review how they've done in relation to the plan that they put in place. We chatted with, we interviewed parents that received the intervention, we interviewed practitioners who delivered it, and one of the things that came out really strongly was the parents really didn't like the advice sheet. They really didn't like the information that that discussed all the different things that might come from their drinking, and really felt that it wasn't something that was relevant to them, and often talked about, the practitioners and the parents talked about a level of resistance to that information. So we took on board the comments that the parents and the practitioners made, and we adapted these interventions, combining actually the brief lifestyle intervention with the simple structured advice. And the reason for that, without again going into the trial in too much detail, is we had some stop-go criteria for the feasibility trial. And what became apparent very early on was that the parents that were randomized to the extended intervention, so who would be offered a referral on to the specialist alcohol provider for that extended intervention, chose not to take up that appointment. So many of them just said no thank you at the point of being offered it, or others said that they would like it, and then when the appointment was offered, they didn't attend it. So it became apparent very early on that that wasn't going to meet the criteria for a feasibility trial, and therefore we decided to combine the 2 interventions into one, and take on board those comments that were made by the parents themselves and the practitioners. So you'll see on this particular sheet that there's far less information. There's less of a structure. It's more open for a conversation. And really the key messages, I guess, that came back around the risk information was that a lot of the risks felt too far in the future, didn't feel relevant today. And many of these families, as I mentioned, were under a lot of stress. And really, the things that they were worried about were the things that were happening today. And they talked a lot about the stresses and strains within their daily lives. That meant by the end of the day, often they saw alcohol as being a way of releasing all of that. And actually, if we were going to make this relevant to parents who are under quite a lot of stress, then the risks that we're discussing within the brief alcohol intervention need to be risks to the daily routine. So instead, we began to look at, what is your typical day like in the family? What's your typical day like in the family when you have a drink? And what about the day after you had a drink? Because one of the things that come through a lot was about was about the daily routine in particular, and I recognise this myself as a parent, the school run. If you get up and you've got little Johnny and he doesn't want to go to school and there's quite a lot of tension trying to get ready and trying to get the child into school without too much distress and conflict, then actually trying to do that when you've got a hangover is a lot harder than trying to do it when maybe you're feeling a little bit clearer in your head and feeling like you have a bit more energy. So the conversations came much more to the daily living experience as opposed to things that might happen in the distant future. And this intervention was further piloted in a naturalistic experiment within a local authority in London through some Public Health England funding. We also, as I mentioned earlier about within the overall study design, we also looked at, we used a discrete choice experiment, and we did that in order to assess preferences for and acceptability of brief alcohol interventions with parents, specifically within the workforce. Discrete choice experiments require respondents to make choices between hypothetical alternatives, and each alternative has a common set of attributes, which are also shown on this particular slide, and I'll explain in a moment. And each of these attributes have a value attached to them, or a level, and the values and the attributes can vary. The results of a discrete choice experiment can therefore provide information on the relative importance of different attributes of a particular intervention configuration and their associated levels. And this is really important because you can have the best intervention in the world, and hopefully, by really engaging with the people who are receiving the intervention, delivering the intervention, we are informed by the things that are important to them. But actually, if nobody then implements the intervention, it's going to be no use to anybody. So we need to find out what are the particular configuration of the intervention which is most acceptable to the workforce, the people who decide whether they're going to do this thing with a parent or not, so that it's most likely to find its way to being provided to a parent or a family member. Now, discrete choice experiments are based upon random utility theory, and the assumption being that when you present somebody with different scenarios, the participant will choose the scenario which maximizes the utility. For example, a decision based upon acceptability. We used the findings of two systematic literature reviews which have been conducted within health, and those systematic literature reviews look specifically at barriers and facilitators for implementing brief alcohol interventions within a health setting. But we also took some of the findings from our qualitative study that I've already presented to try and develop the attributes and levels that we thought may influence social care practitioners' decision to implement a brief alcohol intervention within children's social care. And this resulted ultimately in 8 key attributes with either 2 or 4 levels. We started off with a much bigger list, but through a process of consultation with social care practitioners, and we were able to whittle that down, and also based upon awareness of things that we could actually influence in practice. So we can't, for instance, influence the salaries of social care practitioners, but we can suggest a particular duration for the intervention or a particular level of support in terms of training that practitioners might receive in order to deliver the intervention. The combination of these 8 different attributes and 2 to 4 different levels resulted in a huge number of potential scenarios. It's a little bit like national lottery schemes where you think, you know, I've only got to choose 6 numbers out of a small number. It can't be that hard, but it's about the possible configurations and combinations between those produces lots and lots and lots of different scenarios. So it came up with 80 in total between these. And so what we did is we blocked those into 20 possible scenarios and presented those to practitioners within a questionnaire and asked them to choose between these 2 scenarios. So we'd have a situation where we'd have scenario A, scenario B. Practitioners were asked to look at all 8 attributes together and say, in this situation, would you rather do scenario 1 or would you rather do scenario 2, A, B, sorry. And ultimately, what you get after you've repeated this enough times is you find out what is driving people's decisions. We conducted, we completed 205 questionnaires with social care practitioners. That was achieved through attending 3 conferences on parental alcohol use aimed at children's social care practitioners in London. And then in the Northeast, what we did is we attended a number of different team meetings and invited practitioners to complete the survey for us. And this is what we found. So practitioners ultimately stated a preference for intervening with parents where alcohol was identified as impacting upon the child and the family. So we asked them to think about a variety of different situations, to intervene with any parent, regardless of any identification of risk, so universal provision, versus where risk has been identified based on consumption, where risk has been identified based on an impact upon the child, versus where this was the main safeguarding concern. And what we found was that practitioners were really preferred to intervene where alcohol has been identified as impacting upon the child. That would be the thing that would be really driving that particular decision. And we also found that there was a preference for intervening with both the parent and the child together. So we asked various different scenarios about intervening where it's only the parent that is present versus the parent and the child, and social care practitioners wanted both present. They preferred intervention within the ongoing casework as opposed to at an early stage where they're undertaking assessments. And I guess that's based on the idea that the relationship was necessary for those conversations to happen. They preferred more intensive interventions in generally, so that the highest preference was for 6 sessions, each with 40-minute durations. And this was compared to a very brief intervention, which was more akin to what you'd see in health. And they also preferred less structure. So they preferred anything over a leaflet, but the less structured interventions tended to fare better, particularly the semi-structured discussion, where you have a very basic structure similar to the one that I showed in the 3rd iteration of the intervention. Things that really didn't matter, they didn't care what the organizational support or requirement was. We asked whether, you know, if this was something that was regularly discussed in supervision, or whether there needed to be some kind of organizational monitoring, key performance indicators. That really didn't seem to influence the practitioner's decision. Similarly, the level of training didn't seem important to them, and certainly didn't come out as being a priority. And the thing that was more important than anything, the thing that we conducted an analysis where we compared the relative importance of each of these attributes and each of the levels. And what we found was that the thing that was most important to these practitioners was the risk. They wanted to intervene when they knew already that the child was at risk because of parental alcohol use. Okay, so what did we take from all of this? In health, alcohol is typically identified by a clinician. often use a screening tool, and this is quickly followed by the brief alcohol intervention. Both the screening and brief alcohol intervention activity is conducted usually within a single consultation, and often by a clinician that doesn't have an established relationship with the patient. The intervention is focused on health risk, and that is health risk to the individual drinker. Our findings of the discrete choice experiment suggest that brief alcohol intervention should be adapted to the central function of supporting children and families. Specifically, this requires a move away from screening and brief intervention based upon the identification of health-related risks to one that seeks to identify and prevent family-related risk. And this is reinforced, I guess, by a lot of the findings of the other parts of the study where there was the importance of the family really came through. As there's currently no screening tool that focuses upon the impact of alcohol upon the child or upon the family, this really suggests a move away from universal screening approaches, which are currently recommended in health settings, towards a targeted screening approach, which is based upon observable problems within the family, where the social care practitioner already recognises that alcohol is impacting. In such a situation, screening is far less about identification of risk, which is how we understand it within health, and more about giving practitioners a structure by which to open a conversation with a parent about their alcohol use. Practitioners considered in the DCE, in the discrete choice experiment, and in the qualitative study, that there was a real preference to intervene with parents around alcohol as part of the ongoing casework, and that was all about the importance of the relationship. And this is most likely because of the sensitivity of the topic and the sense that practitioners first need to build up a trusting relationship with the family, particularly the parent. A more flexible approach might be required regarding when to introduce the topic of alcohol within this particular setting and with this particular population, and really affording the practitioner the opportunity to identify alcohol as an issue for the family, and therefore to do that work of connecting alcohol use with child welfare priorities, and to reduce practitioner resistance also to the topic, where the practitioner might not see discussing alcohol as being a priority within their work, unless it is about protecting the family, protecting the child. In such situations, screening is less about identifying risk, more about that conversation. Evidence from other settings, predominantly from primary healthcare, suggests that there's no additional benefit from extending intervention for people who misuse alcohol beyond quite a short, sharp intervention. So single sessions or multiple sessions of no more than 60 minutes in total were identified as being effective in a systematic literature review of brief alcohol interventions in primary care. However, in this setting, we saw a real focus upon more intensive interventions, and often over a longer period of time, with certainly a much higher intensity to them. And I think that's possibly because of that complexity of need, that level of stress that we find with families who are in contact with social care, where they tend to have quite complex needs and multiple vulnerabilities. And certainly the practitioners within the discrete choice experiment stated a preference for these longer, more intensive interventions. And it was a theme that emerged within the qualitative work earlier. So the extended brief intervention may need to support that ongoing development of a trusting relationship, where it's not all of the information provided at one time, that it's more about this ongoing conversation where the practitioner may come back to the topic on a number of occasions, exploring where the parent is in relation to their alcohol use. And therefore it might require a much longer period of time. But given that social care practitioners, certainly in England, in the UK, tend to work for longer periods of time with families, then there may well be a mechanism for introducing such a structure. There was a clear preference for an intervention that involves the child, And this was particularly found, one of the analysis I haven't presented today was we also looked by the level of experience of the practitioner to see if that changed any of the results. And we did find actually that the more experienced practitioners, which we defined as being having been in social care practice for 10 years or more, were particularly keen on involving children in those appointments. And I guess part of that is about, you know, the importance of the voice of the child, and that value in children's social care is based upon the rights of the child. And I can see why colleagues within the profession might identify involvement of children in the sessions as being important in order to make sure that we get the voice of the child within it. And we saw within the qualitative work and also within the systematic literature review that children clearly are a motivator for parents, and therefore there may be some benefit to the parent who uses substances to have some involvement from the child. But we also did see in the qualitative work the sensitivity of that, how there might it might contribute to a sense of judgment. There might be a desire to protect the child from that information, from those disclosures. The children might not be fully aware of the parents' drinking levels, and well-intended efforts to include a child might actually have an adverse effect where the child feels shame, embarrassment about the parents' alcohol use. Cassie Muir, who I've seen on this particular webinar today, has conducted some really great sensitive research with children who are affected by parental substance use. And her research has found that children who are involved in family interventions where there is parental alcohol use can often find it quite unsafe to talk about parental alcohol use, particularly if that information is either sought in front of the parent or is fed back to the parent, and it can actually add to greater conflict in the home, as well as some more significant impacts where children feel unsafe as a result of the information they give. So clearly there's a lot of thought that needs to be given about whether that's in the child's best interests. But similarly, you know, unlike other areas of affected involvement of affected family members in interventions, there isn't potentially a benefit to the parent either of having the child involved. And I remind you of the findings of the meta-analysis with parents whose children were involved in one or more sessions did not reduce the frequency of their alcohol use or the drug use. And as such, we really need to have some care around the involvement of children where parental risky drinking is apparent. And maybe perhaps the solution is about ensuring the child is visible in those interventions, but not involved. And this might be one way of enabling the balancing of the motivation, but also the shame that the parent and the child might experience in those situations. So I guess the main result that I'll conclude upon is that the findings of the parent study suggest that brief intervention structure delivered within health settings may not simply transfer into children's social care and into a population of parents, and rather they really need to be adapted to this particular setting and the needs of population along the lines in the ways that I've discussed over the last 40 minutes or so. So I'm going to leave it there and end my slideshow. So hopefully I can see you again and then see if there's any questions. There we go, back. Gals, you're on mute. We never seem to get the hang of that, do we?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for your brilliant talk. I've just already noticed that in the comments section, first questions plopped up regarding who identifies at-risk drinking. Well, probably before I am looking for further questions, you might specify this a bit.
So who identifies at-risk drinking?
Yeah.
Is that the question? Yeah. So I guess in health, we do this usually by screening tools, and this is often done by tools similar to the audit screening tool. And certainly in the feasibility randomized control trial, we did use the audit tool. We used the audit C, and we did that because we thought that a question based on consumption would maybe help with some of the anxiety around judgment and stigma, particularly the question on the audit that those of you who know the tool will recognize of, have you ever failed to do what was normally expected of you because of your drinking? You ask that of a parent in a threatening situation of social care, we worried that that might make it harder for a parent to disclose their alcohol use. So in that trial, we decided to use the audit C. However, having taken on board the findings of the discrete choice experiment, I think what we need to be doing in children's social care is moving away from screening tools altogether, or certainly as a mechanism by which you identify risk, and instead be using and I think this goes against some things that Sarah Galvani's suggested before. So sorry, Sarah, I do apologize about this. But I think we need to be moving back towards those observable signs and then using, triggering a conversation through the identification that there might be something going on in the family related to alcohol, and then using the screening tool, not as a way of identifying the problem, but as opening the conversation with parents. And we've seen elsewhere in brief alcohol intervention literature that there is a thing around screening reactivity. We're actually asking questions about alcohol and feeding back to the individual that their drinking places them at risk of harm might have some benefit in considering change in itself rather than in the identification of the risk. So I think certainly based on the discrete choice experiment, the suggestion is that the social care practitioner should work with the family to identify that this is a thing for them, and then use the tool instead as a way of opening the conversation and beginning a conversation about what this means for them.
Thank you. So I just... Yes.
Could I come back on that? Is that all right? No, I think we're saying very similar things, Ruth. That's absolutely fine. I think one of the things that my workers, and I've always said, is that there needs to be routine questioning, and by that I don't necessarily mean screening forms.
Sure. Yeah.
So and a lot of what I've tried to express and teach is about not being afraid of having the conversations. It's a conversation first and foremost. So I think we're saying similar things, but I think for me, I think it also depends what stage those risks are at, aren't they? And I think that's the other thing. It's sort of at what point is the practitioner intervening, and how long have they got? Because obviously what pops into play then is that tension, as you know, between the child's timeline and this, maybe slightly resistant, anxious social worker, not quite sure how to ask about alcohol and other drugs, and time can go on because I say, well, we've not built the relationship yet, so I can't quite ask about that yet. So it's actually quite kind of skilled work, I think. So I think, part of that mix, there's something about, I don't know how there's probably a model in there somewhere about, identifying what stage of crisis, it's judged that the family's at, and what state of, to do intervention, have we got time to go in a bit more gently? And it's, it sounds like with the group that you're talking about, then that's probably possible because they're not high risk. It's that at risk, sort of just on that borderline. So, that sounds sensible. But I guess whether they tip over, it'll be, you might not like it, but I'm going to have to, come in a bit harder.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. It's really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Sarah. You're on mute still, Gallus. Gallus, you're on mute.
Okay, a pity. Since there have been some noises during your talk, now I'm trying to do my best to unmute myself as long as I'm not speaking, but it seems difficult to go back again. But anyway, I just wanted to say at the bottom of your screen, you can see the function hands up. So anyone who has got a question, just raise your hand, and then I will, get you in according to the order. Okay, so Richard.
Surprise, surprise. I was going to come in last with all the other questions, which I know people will have, but if people are not raising their hands, I will. A few things. First, obviously, thank you very much, Ruth. That was absolutely lovely. And, you know, the work you're doing is really so excellent and so interesting. And I feel very privileged that we've got you speaking with us today. So thank you for that. And Newcastle should feel very privileged, and I hope they do, having you work with them. So in one sense, it struck me that there were quite a lot of conflicting results that you were presenting, and I'm interested really in what you make of that. So you show from the review you do that really it's only integrated work where you do both alcohol or drugs and family parenting work that works, and if you do them in isolation, then they don't work very well. And then you say, but however, we find from practitioners that what they really want to do, surprise, surprise, is actually, because these are family practitioners, is really leave the alcohol a bit until they really feel confident in doing it and only work on the family stuff. So you've got the evidence saying, really, this is a bad idea. But then practitioners saying, well, we don't know the evidence that well. And anyway, that's any evidence. What we know is what we feel, which is that actually we want to do it our way. And then you show that really having children involved actually, and it's surprising, but actually, and you've got some good reasons for it, actually doesn't work as well. And then you talk to practitioners, and not surprisingly, they say, yeah, but we like to think we want the children to be involved. Children's voices are really important. We need to have them involved. So it seems to me that in a sense, you've got all this conflict. Yeah. You're developing a brief intervention where what people are saying they want to do is contrary to what your evidence analysis seems to suggest is the best thing. So I suppose I want to ask you, I've got other questions, but the main question I want to ask is what are you going to do about that?
Yeah, I think there is things that you can resolve within that. So if I take the first one, first of all, about this idea about having them integrated together. As it is currently, what you often find is that parents get just normal, they get the drug and alcohol treatment system that's available to everybody else. So I guess the thinking behind that finding within the systematic literature review is to not treat them as adults, individual adults, but to treat them as adults who are parents, and really connect the two things. So having conversations, not just about you're drinking too much and it's having this impact upon you. You're drinking above what's recommended and its impact upon your family, and exploring that with them. So that's about bringing the family into it. I guess your point about practitioners wanting to do the family stuff first and come to the alcohol later links in with what Sarah says, which was about how difficult practitioners often find it. And I think there is a whole other science on this about how you get the thing implemented, which I was trying to begin to touch on, I guess, with the discrete choice experiment. But from my point of view, that message about integrated treatment was primarily about what is the content that we give to the parents, and how do we intervene and discuss this matter with the parents. And for me, that's about talking to parents about the family and the daily life, and how alcohol might make daily life a bit more stressful for them. There's stuff about involving children. How do you resolve that? I guess we need to acknowledge that particularly social care doesn't necessarily make all of the decisions based on evidence. They make the decision based on a lot of things, and evidence is one of those things. And I think we need to recognize the other things amongst that mix as well, and try and work within that real world situation with very different and competing priorities and demands in order to resolve those conflicts. But I don't yet have the answer on how to do that, so I'm afraid.
Okay, I can see lots of other hands are up, but while I've got you, I'm going to just ask another couple of questions. One of the things is what I'll just say what both of them. The first one you're saying is that a lot of what you and Sarah were both talking about was social workers working with families where the child was at risk, as opposed to at a high risk or just imminently about to be taken into care. And I was under the impression that social services were so stretched at the moment that basically they don't work with the people you're talking about. They don't work with people with children in need. They know they should, but they just don't have the person power and resources to work with children in need. So in a sense, one could think that you were developing an intervention here for which to be used by social workers who won't be able to use it because they won't actually be seeing these children. And that's one half. The other half of my other question is one of the advantages and problems of having been in this field for what seems like a very long time now, is that I hear things. Thank you for agreeing with that, Sarah. I hear things which remind me of other things that I've heard about in the past. And this idea of trying to get social workers to be involved in working with people with addiction issues has been going on a very long time. And any of us in the field know that it's really not a sensible idea to send parents off to the alcohol services for their alcohol work and to work with children and family social workers for the child work, and then to get somebody involved in mental health work for the mental health problems. And that because relationships are so key, you need to build a key set of relationships where someone does all of those things. So we understand all that, but that's not how the system works very well. So going back to responding to drinking problems in the 1970s, where community alcohol teams were first talked about, this idea of getting frontline practitioners to deal with alcohol as well as the things that they're currently dealing with, and they see as their main role, we've been saying this now for 50 years. So what are we going to do about the fact that your research is saying, yes, I agree with this, good idea, but how do we do it?
Yeah, sure. So the first question was about, do the social workers see these families? And I think, I mean, I've maybe used as a bit of shorthand children's social care because it's an international network and there'll be different languages. But I guess certainly the trial and a lot of the qualitative work was done in early help services, as well as what you might consider to be statutory social work services. So I think some of those families definitely do, some of those workers, definitely do see the families that you would, fit in a variety of different definitions of early intervention, including the safeguarding early intervention. But I do wonder, and I apologise if there's anybody of children's social care who takes a knab reaction to what I'm about to say, because I know it's a bit difficult, some of the recommendations within the care review. But the care review does potentially have some opportunities here, because we're going to see, if the recommendations are supported, a move away from this idea of kind of, early help, child in need of protection, having a situation where you've got a lot of family support right the way to everywhere, right the way up to that statutory intervention threshold, and continuing over that statutory intervention threshold. And I think I spent a lot of my social work practice career really believing that you can combine care and control, and if you've got a skilled enough practitioner, you can do both. And a number of studies that I haven't talked about today that I've been involved in have really made me doubt my own belief on that, actually, and seeing that actually there's something about the separation of the support and safeguarding functions that is really helpful in families who experience that threat that I've described earlier, where actually if you've got somebody whose role it is primarily to support the family, yes, it's still within the context of safeguarding, but families seem to perceive that as being different and less threatening. And so maybe the care review offers some opportunity for support with families, which is less threatening, more helpful. And the workers have a greater emphasis on doing that, and it becomes much more about their role rather than focusing always on the heavy end and adversarial processes. The second question about how we do that, maybe that's partly attended to by that response. I don't know.
I'll pass over to the other people with their hands over. Thank you so much, Ruth.
All right, so I'll hand over to Martha first.
Oh, thank you. I'm the first.
Yeah.
Ruth, very inspiring. Was really good to see this, how you bring the evidence and trying to develop the interventions. That was really inspiring for me, especially getting to this field of research. I just have like, it's just a bit back what Richard says about the complexity, what when to work for what. And I just wonder, like, when you talk about the feasibility study, the second one, and you're talking about changing the targets for the components because it's more seen like what works is more the target for the targets for the next 2 days or something for the parents. But I just wonder if is there needed to change there, or if is, I know it's a feasibility, small, probably sample, but you have explored the different profile of this and see perhaps that long-term might work a little bit more for some kind of family structures than to others.
Sorry, Martha, I was getting a little bit of interruption at my end and I wasn't sure I fully heard the question. I do apologise. Would you mind repeating that?
Oh, it might be my internet. Sorry. No, it's that better?
I think so.
Better? Oh, so just in summary, it's more about like in the second feasibility study that I've sort of forgot the name of the intervention, but the second one that you presented, it's, you say you change the targets for the intervention in terms of the motivations and things. And just, I wonder if it's then needed, or if you have the opportunity to explore a bit more of who are the parents that were involved in the intervention, if there is more difference in the family structure dynamics and just the profile of them, and because the long term might work a little bit more for some kind of parents rather than others. Just wonder if you have opportunity to explore that.
So is this about who it might work for versus I think it's not something we've looked at. The thing about changing the focus in that intervention was based on the qualitative interviews that we did with people we'd piloted the intervention with as part of the feasibility study. And I think what I probably didn't talk about it enough, but what the parents that we spoke to said was that actually, you know, these abstract risks in the future just didn't cut it for them. It wasn't the thing that made them think it was worth going all of the effort of making these changes about, because they just didn't see the point in it. If we could make it much more real to their day-to-day, that was the thing that was more likely to bring about a desire to change, because they could see the benefit, even though they recognized that they had all these other stresses in their life. So it was much more about the content of the intervention rather than the profile of the families that we were taking that information from. I'm sorry, Martha, I'm not sure if that responds to your question at all.
No, you did. I just make me wondering, you know, like if you know, dependent of the complexity of the alcohol involved, and if there is families that are, you know, with alcohol, it's much more problematic, and they are, for example, in the edge of end up involved with kids end up in care or something. If they would see something more long-term plans and things involved than something that's more short.
I guess that comes back a little bit to the conversation we had slightly earlier about, it's all very well hanging about, trying to build the relationship, trying to find the right time to talk about it. But if the situation changes and it becomes more risky, you might not have time for that. And I guess when I started off the feasibility trial, and maybe this is answering a bit better your question, I might be catching on to what you meant, sorry. You know, we were doing anybody who was 5 on the Odyssey and above. Actually, in a trial which is much more focused on observable risks relating to parental alcohol use, the chances are you're not going to get people who are drinking above the recommended amounts only slightly. You're going to get people who are drinking, you know, what you might class as harmful drinkers, and that's going to narrow the population in which we're making this intervention, we're targeting this intervention at. And therefore, we might actually, in doing so, it might be harder to do a trial, but it might make the intervention more salient. And we'll get a lot of interventions, particularly in the brief alcohol intervention field, which are no longer showing results. And it's probably because we're intervening with people who are drinking quite low levels of alcohol, you know, above the recommended amounts. But, you know, the salience of the advice that's in those interventions is not really there, or, you know, at a point when a parent or in other populations, a patient might want to make a change or consider change. So yeah, it's getting more about those harmful level drinkers, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, then there I also have Agnes with a raised hand.
Hi, good morning. Thank you,
Right.
or good afternoon, I guess. I'm from Canada, and so thank you very much for this presentation. I was really interested. We have an organization working with youth who are impacted by the stigma of apparent substance use and embedding services into the healthcare system here. And so I found it really remarkable, and what Jill was saying just related to the conflicting evidence that sort of came out, and what we're seeing also when we talk with youth, and also parents, in the understanding that when we bring up addiction or substance use as a priority factor, that bias, whether it's from the practitioner angle or the family member, is very strong and can limit kind of the conversation or their eagerness to have a conversation about it. And so from the study, I was curious to understand a little bit as well about, for a lot of these individuals, you talked about child welfare involvement, and we know that that's a big fear in a lot of our families, is that intervention and that stain it leaves on the family, on intergenerational cycles of stress and trauma. So was there any, for some of these families, was there conversation related to harm reduction? So not related so much to the substance use, but identifying what are those triggers, what are those underlying issues, and without the focus being on how can you stop using substances, but more of that inclusion of harm reduction approach.
In the later intervention, that final intervention, yeah, I think we're moving much more towards that type of approach and much more discursive in nature. Is it instead of here's the risks, think about the risks, tell me which risks apply, so yeah, I think, and certainly from the later conversations and the final iteration, I think the parents will respond much more positively to more harm reduction approaches. How do we make daily life easier for you is basically the message of that final intervention.
Did you find, sorry, I guess as a follow-up question, did you find from a practitioner angle that there was comfort in having that conversation? Because a lot of times I know here in Canada, we don't have, our healthcare system isn't set up in a way to incorporate a harm reduction approach. It's always, the treatment offered or the support offered is abstinence-based treatment. And so on that flip side, knowing that, and you alluded to this, that, a lot of the families were saying, well, the substance wasn't kind of the problem, it was the stress that led up to that substance use. What was the perception of practitioners on that side of wanting to offer alternatives to abstinence-based treatments and recoveries?
We do have quite good kind of, I guess we have more generally, we have reasonable acceptance of harm reduction approaches across a range of services. But I think in terms of specifically children's social care, including those early help services, it was variable. And the staff often worried that they didn't have the skill and the knowledge to really be able to do that. And that created a lot of insecurity, I think, for the workers. And we see that in lots of issues relating to children's social care, because it feels like such a threatening environment for the parents, but also actually for the practitioners to be in.
Yeah, we're finding the same thing here. We have practitioners say, well, my license is on the line, but then we have that idea of like the fear of I can't say anything or say my true struggles because I will have my children removed or I will be criminalized. So, and thank you for your response.
Wonderful. So since there are no hands up at the moment, I would also take the liberty for another question, which is a bit associated with what Martha already asked. And I was just wondering, mainly with regard to your meta-analysis, that you said you included all risk levels of alcohol use, and that audit score of 5 or more, something like that also was a criterion. And well, as far, actually, the preferences are a bit more than what we usually would consider brief interventions. But anyway, I just wonder what actually are characteristics of the target population and who can successfully be addressed by these interventions, because I would expect that especially people with signs of dependence like loss of control and similar issues might respond far less.
Yeah, absolutely.
And probably this might also be something that influences results, for example, like sessions where children are included or not, because maybe it might be that the studies have different target populations. So what are your thoughts about that?
So our inclusion criteria for the systematic literature review was from anything above the recommended amounts right the way up. However, we didn't find any studies that were below substance abuse dependence thresholds. They often use very different assessments, but all of the studies had quite clearly defined treatment populations within them. So I guess that was quite a similar group. In terms of who we were initially targeting the intervention at, I mean, we were trying to take lessons from the systematic literature review, but then adapt it and make it more relevant for an earlier intervention within a population who was drinking levels, lower levels than what were included in those studies. Just because we didn't, the literature isn't there for to inform early intervention in that population specifically. It is for brief alcohol interventions. Brief alcohol interventions talks about hazardous and harmful drinkers as being the population that benefit from brief alcohol interventions. What I think I've learned from this program of work is it's probably harmful drinkers that would benefit from this intervention, or that the social care practitioners would be willing to implement the intervention for, because of that issue of you would need to be seeing the impact upon the family before this was seen to be the business of a social care practitioner and meeting their priorities and their rights to have that conversation. So I think what we're doing with the brief alcohol intervention is, before dependent levels, before they're really meeting the threshold for alcohol treatment, because clearly those interventions are most likely to be better for those parents, albeit the caveat what I found in the meta-analysis of they probably should be addressing the family as well in an integrated way. But yeah, the interventions that we've developed is for more harmful level drinkers while independent.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? I'm rather sure Richard has some in mind, but
I noticed Anne had a hand up earlier, but it's gone
well,
down.
Anne had to leave actually.
So,
she's happy to discuss these issues further with you in Rotterdam.
Lovely. I look forward to that.
I'll just come back in then with one other thing, because something that has been mentioned a few times, and Agnes has mentioned it from Canada, and Sarah obviously here as well, and you a lot. It's all about how we empower social workers to feel they have the right to talk about things which are clearly important, and how they can have the conversation. And as I say, this goes back, I remember Pip Mason wrote a wonderful handbook in the 1970s, early 70s, about how to raise the issue, how to start the conversation. And I mean, I think with Agnes is talking about what it's like in Canada. Luckily, we don't have such a strong one-size-fits-all abstinence model in the UK, and so we can talk with people about how alcohol use may be affecting various elements of their parenting, and how, as opposed to saying what you've got to do is stop drinking, it's much more about, well, how do you think you could change your drinking in such a way that it might reduce the impact that it has on your children. But it's how to empower social workers to feel that they have the confidence to even to raise the issue, and the right to do that, unless they're seeing problems at such a level of magnitude that they then have to jump in with both feet. So it's how to get people to do it earlier is, I suppose, my question.
Yeah, sure. There's people certainly who are familiar with the UK landscape might be familiar with the Hertfordshire model or the Centre for Family Safeguarding, and they've done a lot of work to try and shift the culture away from adversarial interventions towards supportive interventions. And I think that's a lot about what has been informing some of the things I've said.
Yeah.
It's about giving permission to social workers not to check in people's fridges, you know,
Yes.
and
Yes.
to instead have open conversations and not just assume that parents are trying to hurt their children. Many families are under stress and have difficult situations and need support in those stressful situations to have better outcomes. And so I think it's a cultural shift that's actually needed away from those threatening environments where social workers feel really unsafe as well, given permission to support and believe parents in the first instance. But that's quite a tricky thing to achieve, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Easy words.
And Sarah's going to come back on this as well now. I can see.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, aren't we, really? But I think, you know, I think the issue for me is that having those conversations that we're talking about, Ruth, I think are quite skilled.
Yeah.
And I think the problem is that sort of sets the level of skill at quite a high bar. And when we've got social workers who, and actually, I don't think it's about legitimacy myself. Certainly the recent work that we've done and other people like Hannah, who's on the call, have said, no, they feel absolutely, if you look at, you know, the legitimacy stuff with Cartwright years ago, they absolutely feel it's their, you know, it's legitimate for them to ask about. It's the confidence of knowing what to ask and how to ask it. And for me, and I still go back to the stuff that I did in 2015, it's about engaging and thinking it's their job in the first place. So I think what we've got is this real disconnect with, you know, the departments at a government level in the UK not quite understanding that this is a social issue as well as a health issue. So that's not sort of dripping down into the drivers and in social work education. So social workers are thinking, well, if I don't have it on my social work course, then it really can't be part of my job, can it? You know, it's not that important for me. And therefore, you know, in practice, you get people in one of our studies many years ago saying, I'm angry about this. I'm really angry that no one talked to us about, you know, substance use and domestic violence. I think that's improved a bit, but, you know, that's most of my casework as a children and families practitioner. So, you know, I think there's the drivers at the top level, but I also think that if we can't even get kind of basic substance use beyond, you know, an awareness of it, the stuff around it you mentioned, Ruth, which is so important, around talking, questions to ask, how to ask it, you know, on that agenda, then I think it's a little way to go before we can get them having these sort of really skilled conversations where social workers could just drop it in, you know, in the mix of things. But you know, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, there's some very good courses that are doing, you know, have got substance use at their core, but they're few and far between.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And I think we're running out of time slightly. So once again, I think excellent presentation. Thank you very much for being here. And as we already seen in the chat, there is an option to discuss all these issues and many more face-to-face with Ruth and others in Rotterdam. So if you haven't yet made your mind up, it would be great to see as many of you as possible then. This also means there won't be a webinar in June, so the next webinar will be in July, or at least is scheduled for July, and will be announced at the AFINet website. But before that, hopefully we'll meet in Rotterdam. And the webinar, which also has been a question, has been recorded and will be available on the website. I don't know, most likely, I think in about 1 week's time. So just check the website. And yeah, it was great having you all here, and hopefully see you soon. And also many thanks to Richard, not only for his always stimulating questions, but mainly for making all these webinars possible, and always recruiting brilliant speakers. And so let's meet in Rotterdam and have a great afternoon, night, whatever, from wherever you are. And see you in June.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about my work.
Thank you. Bye-bye.